Hey everybody, I'm so glad you're joining me today as we continue on our journey through Lent with Henry Nouwen's book, The Wounded Healer. Today I thought we would look at two biblical people, historical figures, that were definitely wounded and definitely healers of their entire nation. Two very interesting stories that are not very far-fetched from what we would understand today, because you see, sometimes we read the Bible and we think, oh, I just can't relate to that. So we're going to look at these two particular folks' stories today, and I think you'll see some things that you really probably can relate to. So to put it in a modern context, we're going to be looking at two people today: Joseph, the son of Jacob, and Queen Esther. And you'll see that their stories are very similar. As children, they were both victims of what we would call today human trafficking. It was horrendous. And we see the damage that is inflicted upon these two individuals. But then in the end, as we look through their stories, we see how God uses each one of them mightily to save their nation, to save their people. And we see in them a willingness to be used of God, even though they've experienced such horrible things at the hands of people that would do them harm. And I think maybe some of us can relate to people who want to do us harm, or people who have experienced great trauma, if not human trafficking, then something else. But I think there's a lot to be read and taken away from their stories. So the first story, of course, is Joseph. Some of us remember, even if it was from Bible school, the story of Joseph and his coat of many colors. Well, Joseph was the king. He wasn't the king. He was the son of Jacob. And his story occurs about 2,000 years before Christ. We find his story in the book of Genesis, toward the latter part of it. And long story short, his brothers didn't like him. His father loved him. He was his father's favorite. Excuse me. Pollen is terrible today. So, father's favorite son, brothers can't stand him. Well, the brothers, the older brothers, he was the youngest at the time, all the older brothers decided they're just going to gang up on him one day and kill him. But wisdom gets the better of one of them, and he says, hey, let's not kill him. Let's just sell him into slavery. That way we can get rid of him, but then his blood won't be on our hands. And that's what they do. So they jump on their 17-year-old brother. They're all much older than he is. One day out in the field, and these traders are coming by headed toward Egypt, and they sell him off. And so here goes little baby brother. He hits Egypt, sold as a slave, then imprisoned. And he lives his life coming into adulthood either as a possession of someone else or rotting away in a prison. And he stayed in this place of destitution, in this place of being completely demoralized, because he's over there alone and with no hope whatsoever. And as the story turns out, I hate to give you a spoiler alert, but you really need to hear it, he ends up becoming a great influencer of Pharaoh. And he ends up being given a lot of power over the country of Egypt. And when famine hits that entire region of the world, who comes to Egypt to find food for the family? But the brothers. The brothers show up. They don't recognize him because it's been about 13 to 14 years maybe, before that famine hits. And he's dressed as an Egyptian, and they don't recognize him, but he knows them. And you got to sit there and think, if I were Joseph, I think I now have my vengeance. I can take my wrath out and all this hurt and anger against my brothers. He had the power to do it. But instead, his heart was softened toward them. And when they come begging for food because the family is starving, this is what Joseph says to them. Hear this out of Genesis chapter 50. Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today. What grace to sit there and say, you meant to hurt me, you meant to kill me, and you have put me in this awful place. But what you did, God took it and he turned it into something good. And he's going to use me for good. Therefore, I have no ill will toward you, brothers. That is just an amazing amount of grace and compassion that can only be God-given. But Joseph had to open up his heart to receive it. How many of us have been in bad places and had the opportunity to look at the people who have harmed us and just held on to our bitterness? So I really encourage you to read the story of Joseph, to walk through that journey with him. You'll find his story in the very latter chapters of the book of Genesis, and consider how you would respond in that particular instance. Now, the second person we're looking at is Queen Esther, and now she has her very own book in the Old Testament. It's not very long. I encourage you to read it as well. You can probably get through the entire book of Esther in less than half an hour. Probably even 20 minutes. But the context of Esther's story is about 1,500 years later, whereas Joseph was sold in the Promised Land into Egypt. Esther was born into captivity in Babylon. Yes, her family was exiled out of Jerusalem when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, and she was born in captivity. And that was a bad deal because she lost her parents. Her parents had been killed. She is a foreigner in a foreign land, and in fact, her cousin who was raising her had always taught her to keep her identity hidden because it wasn't so good to be an Israelite in the capital city of Babylon. So I think there was a lot of racism. I think there was a lot of bad things that might happen to you in that sense. So he had always taught her, her real name was Hadassah. But they gave her a Babylonian name of Esther. And he said, don't ever let anybody find out who you are. Well, as it turns out, when she was a young girl, the king of Babylon decided that he needed to get rid of his current queen, and he began looking for a new queen. And he only wanted girls of a certain innocent age. So they didn't have a beauty contest. They had a corralling, a roundup. Soldiers went around and grabbed young ladies that fit the description of what the king might like. And they grabbed up lots of them, and they just took them away. And the way it worked in this particular instance is all these girls were taken into the palace. They were given one night to make friends with the king. And at the end of that one night, they may never see him again. And after he had gotten to know all these young women, he chose which one he liked the best. And if you were not the one chosen, you were sequestered and kept in the king's harem for the rest of your life, because you could no longer go back out into society because you were damaged. They didn't want you out there. You had no life out there. So the king was good enough to say, well, you can live here kind of as my slave. But that was the end of it for you. So there's a lot riding on the line for these young women. Turns out Esther gained the favor of the king, and she became the new queen. Not long after that, there was a decree sent out all over the Babylonian Empire. And the decree said, on this day, anyone may kill or slaughter Israelites, and you can take what they have, you can do anything you want to them, and there will be no problem with that. It will not be against the law. So that left the Israelites that were living out in the empire defenseless. There was going to be no legal help. There was going to be no defense. People were just going to come and slaughter them and take what they've got. Might be wealth, might be livestock, might be their women, and nothing was going to be done about it. And so I'm just amazed at what Esther did. Her cousin sent her a message and said, do you know what's just happened? You are the only one that could possibly fix this situation. And she sent him word back. She said, I can't go say anything because I'm not allowed to even speak to him or see him unless he asks to see me. And he has not asked to see me in well over a month. The way it worked is that she could have been killed if she had gone up and tried to approach the king without his sending for her. Because she was nothing but property. But she prayed about it and she fasted about it. And she said, okay, I'll go. I will take my life into my own hands and I'll see if I can, garner some mercy for our people. And she did. And God was with her in it. And the Israelites, the decree was negated because of her actions. But boy, she took a huge, huge risk in doing so. And you got to think, here's this little girl who has nothing, who's been through a horrible trauma. And she knows that more than likely if she walks into that king's chamber that she's going to be killed. But she did it anyway. And something her cousin had said to her really resounded with me in the story. He said, you don't have to go do anything, but consider if maybe this can be used, that you're in this place for a reason. And that reason is to help your nation. And she was encouraged to go on and try. She was the only influence the Israelites had with that king. Just as Joseph was the influencer of Pharaoh in Egypt. And even though they had had really bad things happen to them, hundreds of thousands of people were saved because of where they were and the position they were in. Now, I'm not saying God put them in those positions because I don't believe it's God's will for anything like that to happen to anybody, but he took that situation and he worked with those people and he used it for good to help others. When we have bad things happen to us, do we turn inside and become bitter and angry with God and become self-absorbed? Or do we allow God to continue to stay in our lives, to work through us, to use us in the places where we are? Or maybe from our past experiences, do we let him use those experiences to help others, to be influencers for good in similar situations? It's a lot to think about today, but I sincerely encourage you, go read those stories. I think you'll see some things that resonate with you in them. I certainly do. And as always, if you need a place to worship, if you need a place to come and be a part of God's family, we welcome you to Grace here in Birmingham, a United Methodist congregation. Be well, friends.
I keep fighting voices in my mind that say I'm not enough. Every single lie that tells me I will never measure up. Am I more than just the sum of every high and every low? Remind me once again just who I am, because I need to know.